30,000 different readings in the Old Testament and the 300,000 in the New. These facts show how a mortal and material sense stole into the divine record with its own hue, darkening to some extent the inspired pages. She's a really good writer. A lot better than Joseph Smith. Yeah, I mean, it really sounds like the Da Vinci Code. And she's basically correct, except that depending on how we count up what variants are, it's probably in excess of 400,000 rather than 300,000. But who's counting? Now, the average Christian, or the average skeptic, the average person, hearing these numbers is just entirely freaked out. And give me the next slide, James. Okay, here's a good slide from Bart. He says, there are more variations among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. And that's true. In New Testament textual criticism talk, that's an accurate statement. He says this, mistakes multiply and get repeated. Sometimes they get corrected. Sometimes they get compounded, and so it goes for centuries. And so how do they multiply? But it's because they were copying them. And most of the copyists were not professional scribes. But even professional scribes in ancient times were not doing great stuff. And they're not, they didn't have word processing where you could just cut and paste. He says this, the more I study the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, the more I discover just how radically the texts have been altered over the years at the hands of scribes who were not only conserving Scripture, but also changing it. And so he's marveling at this. Now, here's what an equally qualified New Testament scholar says. He says, I wonder why that's running off the bottom of the page. But anyway, as one might expect, however, these raw numbers, there are over 400,000 variants in the manuscripts, are somewhat deceptive. For the vast majority of these textual differences are easily recognized as simple scribal mistakes, errors caused by carelessness, ineptitude, or fatigue. The single largest category of mistake is orthographic. Orthographic is just a $5 word for misspelled. An examination of almost any of our oldest manuscripts will show that scribes in antiquity could spell no better than most people can today. Scribes can at least be excused on this score. They lived, after all, in a world that was, for the most part, without dictionaries, let alone spell check. So he's done grading, and he's just irritated with his students. And so let's see who this equally qualified scholar is. Next slide, please. It's Bart Ehrman. This is an academic paper that he's writing for his peers. Okay, we can pass this up, but I do want to. Okay, so these are Josh McDowell's old numbers, and they are woefully out of date. So if you're using these numbers, you need to stop. They were pretty much state of the art in the late 60s, early 70s. Yeah, this is not doing it either. Okay, so anyway, I'll just talk.
No, I'm back here, so I can help.
Okay, so this is an issue for Bart, because Bart was raised as a fundamentalist as opposed to an evangelical. Now, Bart makes no distinctions between evangelicals and fundamentalists. Now, he knows me, he knows Mike Lacona, he knows Rob Bowman, these sorts of things, and he just thinks that we're exceptions to the rule. Because that's the quarters that he grew up in as a fundamentalist Christian, they just didn't accept good scholarship. And so this is a real issue for him. You know, if the Bible is inspired, why hasn't it been preserved? And now think about it for a moment. What would have to be the case for the sort of preservation that Bart Ehrman's talking about, that every second, third, fourth century copyist would have to be inspired? You know, if inspiration included preservation of the copies, not simply the originals. And that's what inerrantists say, that inerrancy applies only to the originals. Then what's the issue with copying mistakes? It's just human error. But if that theory was also true, then when I copy the New Testament today, it has to correct my misspellings, or my dropping of a word, or my repeating of a word, or my skipping of a line, that sort of thing. And of course, that's just an absurd position to hold. So Bart never unpacks that presupposition. Does that make some sense?
Sure.
Also, so the single largest variant, the vast majority of them, are simply misspelled words. Okay? The second, and now let me say something about misspelled words. Spelling wasn't standardized in the ancient days. In fact, standardized spelling is basically a post-Gutenberg phenomenon. For instance, years ago, I was translating from German to English a sermon by Martin Luther. And Luther used Frochterdeutsch. It's ancient, it's not like medieval German, it's kind of like Old English. And if you've ever heard Old English, it doesn't sound anything remotely like English.
Right.
But I was doing okay until I got to something I just couldn't get past. And I finally realized he has spelled the same word two different ways on the same page, because standardized spelling wasn't a thing. Well, then it's not misspelled, and it is actually not an error, but it is a difference. And we need to be careful about saying difference rather than error. Or then sometimes we find that differences take place from saying the same thing in a different word order, because Greek, like German or Spanish or Latin, is an inflected language, and it doesn't really matter what word order you say it in. Or sometimes the copyist copies for sense. You know, so if I wanted to say I grew up in Germany, I might say, als ein Kind, my family lived in Stuttgart und Nürnberg. Or I could say, wenn ich war ein Kind, my family lived in Stuttgart. That sort of thing. It's the same statement, but different words. And so this is one of the things, however, that troubles Bart. Okay? Second thing that troubles Bart is, and I will talk about the empty tomb eventually. I will get there. I promise. The second thing that troubles Bart is that he has accepted the form-critical paradigm of understanding the construction of the New Testament. And so I'd like to unpack a bit of that, and I can send you these PowerPoints. So every bad idea in scholarship has a germ of truth in it, okay? And so there is some common sense gone wrong in this paradigm. And I have to say paradigm sometimes in class because I have students from Mississippi. And, so one of the common sense things that's right about form criticism is the recognition that there was a gospel before there were gospels. There was the good news about what God had done in Jesus before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so, Peter's preaching the gospel on Pentecost, AD 33 or AD 30 or somewhere in that range. And Peter is not saying, look in the Gospel of Mark and see this. Okay, so there were these stories of Jesus that were floating about. Well, of course there were. Anybody with a germ of common sense could understand that. And so then the question that German critical scholars, Karl Ludwig Schmidt, Rudolf Bultmann, and Martin Debelius, they're the three fathers of form criticism. The questions that they had was, well, what did the oral tradition look like? And they decided that the oral tradition in the first century Palestinian world looked very much like the oral tradition that they were familiar with as German scholars, which was the Grimm brothers, the Brothers Grimm. Now, how many of you watched that television show Grimm? It's a lot grimmer than the fairy tales, isn't it? And it's much closer to what the Grimm brothers actually did. And the Grimm brothers were actually doing academic study of German oral stories. And that's why there's so much German language in the characters, that sort of thing. But the first century Palestinian world was nothing like early modern Germany. And so they had the wrong paradigm. And so in the Grimm brothers stories, they're just purely for entertainment. And it doesn't matter if you change this part or that part. But the oral stories about Jesus were not for entertainment. They were for life change. That they were meant to be taken seriously, and the details mattered. Now, not every word mattered, because that's a modern phenomenon that comes with movable type and word processing and that sort of thing. But the ideas matter. And you can only change the words so much, okay? I can change as a child to Als ein Kind or Finnish war ein Kind, but I can't take the word Kind, a child, out of it. That sort of thing, So there's not the flexibility. There was some flexibility, and so then modern scholarship, which Bart is aware of, he just won't recognize the legitimacy of it, basically says we've got three models, and Kenneth Bailey, if you want to see a scholar who writes about this pretty clearly. Kenneth Bailey is a British New Testament scholar. I think he's passed away. But he was a missionary to the Middle East, and he worked with Bedouin people who didn't have written languages. And yet they had their tribal histories. And so he looks at how oral languages, oral cultures would have preserved their history. And he says that what they do is you have I'm searching for the absolute academic terms. So you have a tribe and of people, and anybody. There are two ways to look at it. only the leaders can tell the story, or anyone can tell the story. Okay? So the leaders telling the story is a controlled story. And then anyone telling the story is uncontrolled. Or maybe it's backwards. There's formal and informal and controlled and uncontrolled. And I think formal is the leaders telling the story. Informal is anyone telling the story. Uncontrolled is anyone can tell the story any old way they want to. You know, so Jesus healed Obi-Wan Kenobi of leprosy. That's an uncontrolled story. Well, you guys know that can't possibly be the case. And so Bailey says there are three models: formal controlled, formal uncontrolled, or informal uncontrolled or controlled. And he says that looking at Bedouin culture, which is much closer to what the Middle East was in the first century, what they do is they have a informal controlled. And so the elders, you know, say when a young person is telling the story, if he puts something in, no. You know, back you must go. That is much closer than what Bultmann thought it was. But Bart has accepted this form critical paradigm, and he just doesn't question it. And so you see how these little mistakes in interpreting data can really get us off on the wrong road. So,
Hey, Bob, do we need to go further ahead to catch up with you?
I don't think so, because now I think I've given you a bit to understand how Bart thinks. Let me just say a couple other things about how Bart thinks, and then we'll look at the empty tomb, or whether there was a tomb. If you've read a lot of Bart Ehrman, you will notice that he commonly does several things. Almost every book that he writes, he has his testimony in. As somebody said recently at this conference, that testimonies have great power. He deconverted. He was a fundamentalist Christian, went to Moody Bible College, went to Wheaton, and then went on to Princeton. And at Princeton, he became a liberal Christian. And then he went on and was teaching at the University of North Carolina and moved further down the line from liberal Christianity to agnostic New Testament scholar. And he shares all this and some of his reasoning in it. And it's very powerful to people who have doubts. And almost all the time, Bart is absolutely right on the facts, on the data, but he puts his own spin on the data. Now, here's something that I think pastors are responsible for. In some ways, we have to blame our pastors for the fact that Bart is a best-selling author and that he has influenced so many people to have doubts about the Bible. And that is because we haven't told our people how the Bible came to be. We haven't told them about these errors. So if they read the Da Vinci Code or if they read a Bart Ehrman book, then they're stunned. And you know, we live in a day when all of us that have a smartphone have a Bible app. And I've got like 98 English translations on my phone. And it may be in the hundreds. I mean, I've got 3 or 4 German translations. I've got 5 or 6 Greek translations that anybody could have just on their phone. that sort of thing. So you're in a Sunday school class. Somebody goes to, say, the Ethiopian eunuch. And after the eunuch says, I believe that Christ is the Son of God, well, he doesn't say that in some translations. Because there's a variant there. And so some translations, like the King James Version or New King James Version, it's in the text. New American Standard has it in the text, but there are brackets around that verse. NIV and ESV move it entirely into the margins. In the margin, you will read some passages, some early manuscripts don't have 838, and then you go like from 838 to 839, and And so you've got a Southern Baptist class or evangelical free class of lay people, and one person's reading from one translation, and, well, I wonder why yours is the demonic translation. And I promise you that the approach that most pastors have taken is, I don't want to upset my people by telling them the truth. You protect your people by telling them the truth, but all of the truth and nothing but the truth. And it's pastoral irresponsibility that has set us up for Bart Ehrman to lead people to be skeptical, to be liberals, to be agnostics, or even to just go all the way into atheism. That sort of thing. And, we need to tell our people. The Bible is the inspired, inerrant, infallible Word of God. But it has at least 300,000 differences in the roughly 100 million words of all of the New Testament manuscripts that we have. And that's, what we need to count is not that there are 230-some thousand words in any single New Testament manuscript. But how many words are there among all the manuscripts that we're pulling all of these from? And then it's around 1% to 2% that we have issues with. And we have text critics who can make sense of why the variants are there in the first place. Does that make some sense? Okay. But Bart will establish himself as an expert in that sense. He'll give his testimony, and then he'll also do this. He will also show you kooky ideas. Like Bart wrote a whole book against the Da Vinci Code. So I'm not one of these guys out there that's trying to change your beliefs. I'm just telling you the truth because you haven't heard it. Bart wrote a whole book about mythicism. Did Jesus exist? Bart thinks one of the most dangerous things to agnosticism and atheism is this stupid idea that Jesus never existed. And so he corrects these kooky ideas. And what happens then is you buy into, he's an objective person. He's a world-class text critic. And Bart Ehrman is probably in the top 5 New Testament text critics living today. He's a legit scholar. Okay? And so then you come to trust not only that he's educated, that he's qualified, but that he's objective. And he's not. And then he uses his authority to say things that he doesn't support and things that even are not true. But he's careful to have plausible deniability. Remember I said he's mostly right on the facts, but wrong on the details. So let me share with you an area like, we will talk about was Jesus buried at some point. But I'm trying to be helpful to you by helping you understand why Bart thinks the way he does.
Right.
Because if I tell you only how to refute Bart, but you don't understand why Bart thinks the way he thinks, when you get up in public and do a talk like this, then somebody will say, well, let's go deeper, but you can't go deeper. Okay? So I'm trying to be truly helpful. It just maybe not be. So An example would be, Bart will frequently say that all we have are copies of copies of copies, and that the people who wrote the Gospels, nobody knows who they were. They are anonymous Gospels. Well, that's kind of true and absolutely false. Now, he says it in his Intro to New Testament. I think I went through and did a word search. He says it 13 times. The earliest Gospels were anonymous. The earliest Gospels were anonymous. The earliest Gospels are anonymous. At one point he says, as we've seen, the earliest Gospels were anonymous. Where did we see it? You just said it and didn't show us any data to demonstrate it. So, why is he saying this? Because the earliest manuscripts, which are fragments of the Gospels, don't say who the author was. So the earliest manuscript that we have presently, that we think we have presently, is from John 19. And it's about half of John 19, maybe a third of John 19. And we know it's John 19, and it's fairly stable with John 19 in any modern translation. Doesn't say who wrote it. Why not? It's a fragment. And what would happen with ancient Gospels or ancient biographies or ancient histories is that the author would tell you who he was at the beginning and at the end. And the Gospel of Thomas is a great example of this. We have 1.5 manuscripts of the Gospel of Thomas. Now, we'd heard about the Gospel of Thomas from patristic scholars years before we realized in the late 40s that we actually had the Gospel of Thomas. In the late 40s, at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, they found a Coptic translation of the Gospel of Thomas. And then they realized, now, it was a complete translation. You know how it began? The opening line of it? These are the secret sayings of Judas Didymus Thomas. Oh, so at the beginning, Thomas names himself as the author. You know how it ends? The Gospel of Thomas. So the beginning or the end or both would be how you have. So why would we think that part of a chapter from John 19 would include John wrote it, John wrote it? It's just bizarre. And so our earliest manuscripts are not complete manuscripts. You know what all of our earliest complete manuscripts of the Gospel of John include?
John 19.
John wrote them. You know what happens with all of our earliest complete manuscripts of Mark say? Mark. You know what all of Matthew says? Matthew. All of Luke? Luke. There are no complete manuscripts that say anything other than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. That is a phenomenal coincidence. If they were actually anonymous. You know, not to include the author's name is not the same thing as being an anonymous gospel. And Bart knows this. He's a brilliant guy. But do you see how he uses the trust that he builds up then to mislead you? Now, why does he do this? Because he was taught this. Brant Petrie, I don't know if you know that name. He's a Catholic New Testament scholar, younger than I am, brilliant guy. He said that when he began to study in this area, he had questions. Where are the anonymous Gospels? Where are the anonymous Gospels? what he found out was when you say gospel is an entire gospel, there are no anonymous gospels. But do you see how that sets people up?
Sure.
Okay, so let's talk about, how much time have I got now? Like 35 minutes, something like that?
35, 40.
Okay, so let me get my PowerPoint up here, and we will talk about the empty tomb. And or whether there was a tomb at all. And so I'm going to put my clicker in here. Okay. And we will find out.
James,
This is,
you can catch up with YouTube in the back, I think.
can we?
If it's the same PowerPoint,
This is the PowerPoint on was Jesus buried. This the PowerPoint that's on the screen was can we trust?
is it on the thumb drive?
I think it is.
No, it's a different PowerPoint.
Okay.
So, in this file, and I will send it to you, I also talked about John Dominic Crossan, who was the co-chair of the Jesus Seminar, and he was probably the first person to say Jesus wasn't buried. Now, do you see how clever this line of thought is? That if Jesus wasn't buried, then he wasn't raised. If his body was left on the cross, then all these stories about women at the empty tomb are just fiction. If he was thrown out for wild dogs to eat, it's just fiction. And now Crossan does it for different reasons than Ehrman does. I'm going to talk about Ehrman, not Crossan. So but let me get up to, okay, so when you get up that slide, I need you to go to the slide where Bart's pictured, and it says John Dominic Crossan had made this, yeah. Well, let's do
There.
it. That's the slide I need. Those earlier books were the two last books that I co-wrote with Bart. I have copies of one of them that Bart and Craig Evans and I did together. And if you want a copy, they're little books. They're $15. That's cheaper than you can buy a hard copy on Amazon. Okay, so Bart says this. Now, this is in his book, How Did Jesus Become God? And he says, John Dominic Crossan has made the rather infamous suggestion that Jesus' body was not raised from the dead, but was eaten by dogs. When I first heard this suggestion, I was no longer a Christian, and so was not religiously outraged, but I did think it was excessive and sensationalist. But that was before I did any real research on the matter. My view now is that we do not know and cannot know what actually happened to Jesus' body. Now, know is a very important word here. And it plays on this idea that I unpacked last night about when you say no, do you mean 100% mathematical, logical type certainty, or do you mean you have a justified belief? You have something that you rationally should believe. And what he means here is 100% certainty. But notice, strictly speaking, that Bart doesn't deny that Jesus was buried, but rather maintains we do not know, we cannot know what actually happened. But he really thinks Jesus wasn't buried. Okay? So he appeals, his argument is based both on internal biblical evidence and on external, ancient cultural evidence about crucifixion and burial. But its primary internal evidence comes from 1 Corinthians 15, which may sound odd to some of you because that's the area, that's the chapter we go to when we want to argue for the resurrection, and he's actually going to argue against it. And 1 Corinthians 15 is, historically speaking, the earliest Christian writing that talks about the resurrection, because it was written earlier than Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Okay? And it's based on the absence of several details. And so Bart says, why is it in 1 Corinthians 15 that Paul doesn't mention Joseph of Arimathea? And so there we go. And now notice, 1 Corinthians 15 contains a pre-Pauline creed or a hymn, this sort of thing. And Gary Habermas has done a lot with this sort of thing. And so Bart lays it out for us. Let's see the next slide. There we go. And so what we see is like it's strophic. It's like a hymn would be. 1A, Christ died. 2A, for our sins. 3A, in accordance with the Scriptures. 4A, he was buried. 1B, Christ was raised. 2B, on the third day. 3B, in accordance with the Scriptures. And he appeared to Cephas. And Bart says, well, he mentions Peter or Cephas, but he doesn't mention that Jesus was buried by Joseph. And so his question is, why doesn't this say, and he was buried by Joseph? And he's going to make a huge deal of it. He says, it appears asymmetrical. And so he says, why doesn't it read symmetrically? I think that's an interesting literary question, but I don't think it's an interesting historical question. Okay? All right, so next slide. So there's what. And so next slide says this. It would have been very easy indeed to make the parallel precise simply by saying he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. Why didn't the author make this precise parallel? My hunch is that it is because he knew nothing about a burial of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea. I should point out that nowhere else does Paul ever say anything about Joseph of Arimathea or the way in which Jesus was buried. Not in this creed, not in the rest of 1 Corinthians, and not in any of his other letters. Ooh. The question I have for Bart is, why should Paul do this? The issue of Jesus' resurrection isn't influenced at all by who buried him. And Paul's purpose in 1 Corinthians 15 is not to argue that Jesus was buried, but that there will be a general resurrection at the end of the age, which was what the Corinthians had doubts about, or some of them denied. And so his argument runs this way. Premise 1, if there is no resurrection, then even Jesus was not raised from the dead. Premise 2, but Jesus was raised from the dead, therefore it's not true that there is no resurrection. And so his point is not Jesus' resurrection. He's working from Jesus' resurrection, which they all believed was the case. Furthermore, the Corinthians were primarily Greeks, not Jews. Why would they care about Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin?
Right.
Additionally, since Bart thinks that Paul adapted creeds in his letters, why not here? You know, why doesn't he say, he asked the question, why does he leave Joseph out? I would say, why does he put Peter in? And I think it's likely the case that Peter is an insertion into the creed, onto the creed, that sort of thing. But that's a literary question, not a... But the issue is not ease with which Paul could have done it, but rather purpose. Why should Paul do it? Creeds are by their very nature short and precise, and one could pick out many things that aren't in the creeds. Okay? Why doesn't the creed say, and there were two other guys crucified with him? And they broke the legs of the two other guys, but they didn't break Jesus' legs because he was already dead, which is in keeping with, creeds are just teeny bits of really important stuff. And understand this, historians don't have to quote any creed at all. And they certainly don't have to quote them verbatim for the creed to support their case. Does it make any sense to you? But here's why Paul would add Peter to a creed where Peter wasn't included. Because he's listing witnesses to the resurrected Jesus. And this means to the crucified Jesus. And this means that he was buried. But Bart also has a second line of reasoning. He asks, why weren't the women included? After all, the Gospels tell us that the women were the first witnesses at the tomb. But Paul says 1 Peter. But Peter wasn't historically the first witness of the tomb, witness of the empty tomb. I think that's a better question, but I think there's an obvious answer as well. And that goes back to what is Paul's point in 1 Corinthians 15. He's dealing with deniers of the general resurrection of the dead, and he wants to say, this is the authoritative gospel. Peter, James, the rest of the 12, 500 witnesses, most of whom are still living today. He's establishing the authority of the gospel. He's not talking about the chronology of the gospel. Does that make some sense to you?
Yeah.
Okay. Ehrman also thinks that it's unlikely that Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate, because in the Gospels we read that the whole council was opposed to Jesus. And that Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the council, so that a member of the council would never have wanted Jesus to have a proper burial. Move the slides up again to the one. No, why is... Go back.
Go back.
I think so. Yeah. There. Okay. Why? Okay, so this is Bart from How Did Jesus Become God? Why, after Jesus is dead, is he suddenly risking himself, as implied by the fact that he had to gather up his courage and seeking to do an act of mercy by arranging for a decent burial for Jesus' corpse? Mark gives us no clue. My hunch, Bart's hunch, is that the trial narrative and the burial narrative come from different sets of traditions inherited by Mark. Remember, I said he buys into this idea that there's free-floating traditions out there. Or did Mark simply invent one of these two traditions himself and overlook the apparent discrepancy? So that's Bart's hunch. My hunch is this. Jewish law expressly commanded Jews to bury their dead. Even criminals on the day of their death. Deuteronomy 21, which I'm pretty sure, okay, I'll just read it to you. I think that's there. Deuteronomy 21. I'll read it. When someone is convicted of a crime punishable by death and is executed, and you hang him on a tree, his corpse must not remain all night upon the tree. You shall bury him that same day. For anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you for possession. Okay? Now let's understand this. Crucifixion is a bad way to die. And it's also a bad way to execute a lot of people. It's not an efficient means of execution. It takes a lot of manpower, it takes a lot of material, it takes a lot of time. Just lopping their heads off with a sword would be a much quicker, more efficient way of executing a criminal. So why did the ancient Romans practice crucifixion? To intimidate the living, not to punish the guilty. And most of the ancient religions, like Judaism, had very strict commandments as to what was to be done with the body to ensure a blessed afterlife, if they believed in a blessed afterlife. And so what they were saying was, we can punish you in this life. We can kill you slowly and painfully in a humiliating death, but we can do more than that. We can ruin your afterlife as well. Do you understand how effective that would be as a means of terrorism? State-sponsored terrorism. Now, the Romans did that, and we have documents saying this. But I want to point out that these documents come from the rebellion that has yet to come when Paul writes 1 Corinthians. And that's the rebellion of around AD 70. And so what we see then is Roman rulers dealing with Jewish insurrectionists. But Pilate knew that Jesus wasn't an insurrectionist. Jesus goes before Pilate and he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus says, "I am, but my kingdom is not of this world." Now, Jesus doesn't mean that my kingdom's a spiritual kingdom in terms of metaphysics. What he means, the better translation is, my kingdom is not according to the ways of this world. If it were, my disciples would be fighting right now. My kingdom's not established by military, political, violent means, but it's established by self-sacrificing love. Does that make some sense to you?
Sure.
And so, obviously, Pilate knows that Jesus is not an insurrectionist. Pilate is a pragmatic person, and he crucifies Jesus to make the Jewish leaders happy because he doesn't want any things to mess up Passover weekend. Okay. So, let's see, Deuteronomy 21:23. His corpse must not remain all night upon the tree. You shall bury him that same day. For anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you for possession. So let's understand what the guidelines, why that guideline is given about how the dead are to be buried. It's about the land. Judaism is about three things: land, law, and lineage. You must not defile the land that your covenant God has graciously given you. That's what it's about. That's why, even if Joseph was among the number. Now, John tells us that Joseph was secretly a disciple. And so then Bart would say, but the whole council was opposed to him. Bart, have you ever heard of a hyperbole? Everybody knows. Bart says that. Everybody, well, here's what scholars know. Bart knows that not all scholars. Bart uses hyperbole all the time. Some of my students are from Alabama. That's okay. The execution of 5 Amorite kings in Joshua 10 provides a narrative that demonstrates that ancient Jews would not deny even enemies a proper burial. So let's look at Joshua 10. After Joshua struck them down and put them to death, he hung them on 5 trees, and they hung on the trees until evening. At sunset, Joshua commanded, and they took them down from the trees and threw them into the cave where they had hidden themselves. They set large stones against the mouth of the cave, which remain to this very day. So we see that this was actually done, that actually criminals received a decent burial. The Mishnah, the rabbinic writings, also make sense of this. This is Mishnah Sanhedrin 6:5. And the sages, previous rabbis, scholars, said not only this, that an executed transgressor must be buried on the same day that he is killed. After the executed transgressor is taken down, he is buried, and that they would not bury him in his ancestral burial plot. Jewish laws and customs make Joseph's actions seem entirely reasonable. Remember what it says. Joseph had a newly hewn tomb. And he goes to Pilate and says, please give me the body. I will bury it, not in my ancestral tomb, not in his ancestral tomb, but in this new tomb where nobody else is going to be buried incorrupted. You see how much historical sense? I've got 5 minutes. So that's the internal evidence, and I think it's just a terribly weak argument. Ehrman's primary external evidence is based upon the nature and practice of Roman execution victims. And he argues that it's just never done that an execution victim received a decent burial, because he's going to these places where they're crucifying rebels. And unfortunately, we know that he's wrong on this point about it never being done. Now let's move to the next slide. And I don't have time to read over this, but in 1968, we found a clear case of a crucifixion victim in an ossuary, which indicates proper Jewish burial. Where the next slide, and this is a picture of his ankle bone. They couldn't get the nail out because it was bent, and so they just left it in. And so we know that, but we have more than this to go on. Dozens, if not hundreds, of calcium-tainted nails are buried with bones in Jewish 1st, 2nd century, Second Temple Jewish ossuaries. And that, why would they have these calcium-tainted nails in the bone box? Crucifixion victims. So the archaeological evidence is against Jesus. Roman evidence, the digest is a summary of Roman law. I will send this to anyone who wants this. I don't have time to read over it in 5 minutes. Philo argues against it. The Digesta, which is a summary of Roman law, argues against it. There is the Dead Sea Scrolls argue against Bart Ehrman. Now, when I cite the scrolls, which I do in the PowerPoint file I'll give you, Josephus talks about Pilate backing down. But go to the slide of Jody Magnus. It's close to the end. Jody is a Jewish scholar, not a Christian. She's an archaeologist, And she teaches, lo and behold, at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, the very same school Bart teaches at. And she says this: gospel accounts of Jesus' burial are largely consistent with the archaeological evidence. Although archaeology does not prove that there was a follower of Jesus named Joseph of Arimathea, or that Pontius Pilate granted his request for Jesus' body, the gospel accounts describing Jesus' removal from the cross and burial are consistent with archaeological evidence and with Jewish law. And this was published in a book for lay people about biblical archaeology. She's not got a dog in this fight as a Jewish archaeologist. So let me wrap this up. We owe it to our people to tell them the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about how our Bible came to be. And so when I go on university campuses and talk about one issue or another in this relationship, the gotcha question that I frequently get is the Bible in your hand the inspired, inerrant, infallible Word of God? Now, inerrancy, strictly speaking, only pertains to the originals. And of course, we have no original manuscript of any book of the Bible, Old or New Testament. Okay? So, what do you say? Is the New American Standard, is the Elect Standard Version, ESV, the Net Bible is the one that I like best, New English Translation. But regardless, is that the Word of God? And the answer is to the degree that it corresponds to the original. And we have great reason, historically speaking, to think that is a very high degree. It is. Do you understand? Has this helped you some? I know it's been like drinking from a fire hydrant, and that I've hopped all over the page, all over the world. But I want not only to say, here's why Bart's wrong on the burial, but to help you understand how Bart's mind works, and then how you need to argue against these things. He is far too clever for there to ever be one single bullet argument. And I find that my apologetics students, they just want 50 silver bullets that will slay every objection out there. And they want to put that argument out there and have people go, oh, well, let's pray. I'll just trust Jesus right now. Right. And rather than say, but what about? We need to train our people to be scholars, to think deeply, seriously about theology, about God's Word, about the history behind the Scripture, and so that we can more effectively preach the gospel. You got questions? Yeah.
Have you followed the Associates of Biblical Research there in the Pennsylvania area? I heard a similar presentation where they argue along similar lines that you're presenting.
Never heard of it.
Okay.
But
I need to pass their website. It's
I don't
a
like
treasure
anybody
trove.
from Pennsylvania. No, I'd be interested in talking more about it after.
Definitely. So.
Yep.
Yeah, concerning Paul, do you think he wrote the book of Hebrews?
No, I don't think Paul wrote Hebrews.
Really?
Right.
Who would you say?
I have no idea.
Could be anybody.
No, I really do have some ideas. I think the likeliest, I don't want to use that word even. I think Apollos is a candidate. I think Luke is a candidate. But I'm pretty confident that Paul did not write Hebrews. I'm going to side with the church father Origen, frequently called Origen. But I would point out that there is no letter jamma in the Greek alphabet. And so I'll side with Oregon, who said only God knows. But what the early church did know is this is the word of God.
Exactly. On a couple of the accounts, when we were looking at Deuteronomy, I know that it says hung on a tree, but I think what they're referring to, if I'm correct, is that they would put them for display after they killed these suppressors. Is that what that was? 'Cause it wasn't crucifixion back then in Deuteronomy, was it? Because the Romans
Well, they
perfected
hanged them,
would be
and
reference to.
the Romans did not invent crucifixion.
Right, but they perfected it, but
Yeah,
they didn't. Yeah.
it's kind of like the Japanese. They didn't invent many things, but they mass marketed.
Yes, exactly.
Good
So was
imitators.
crucifixion around that time then, or during Deuteronomy, you think? When Deuteronomy,
Well,
or
crucifixion normally didn't include nails. You just hang somebody on a tree and they die.
Okay, suffocation.
Yeah.
Okay,
um,
so that's pretty accurate then. Very
Well, I
accurate.
don't know. I'm not saying, yeah, Jews are crucifying people. In fact, I think ancient Jews were not crucifying people, but anybody hung on a tree was cursed, regardless. And that would be another reason for Pilate to allow a burial,
Sure.
because he's already cursed Jesus.
Yeah, right.
And, you know, in the case of Jews, we've already accomplished wrecking your afterlife.
Right, exactly.
And-
Interesting.
But, you know, Pilate is a pragmatist, and I have material about that. So you can reach me at rstewart@nobbits.edu, and I'll be happy to send this to you. Also, I have some of this will be written up. I think I have 7 papers on this topic that also talk about how history is done or should be done. So if any of you want one of those papers, it's just less stuff that I have to carry back. It's a draft for a book that I'm in honor of another scholar, Festschrift, that I'm working on. And so I'll be happy to give you that too.
Awesome, thanks.
All right.
Great.
God bless you.
God bless you. Very good.
Thank you.
Bob.
Yep.
Hey,
I always heard that people that Paul wrote Hebrews.
no, internally in the
Yeah,
book
I
of
remember
Hebrews
that.
itself, Rob Bowman gave a presentation
Yeah,
about this
saw
very
the
issue.
James
He
Bob-
believes inside the book of Hebrews it can't be Paul.
Oh, really?
And he argues it from certain Bible verses. That's why he says that it's internal in the book of Hebrews that it can't be Paul, because of the references that
Not that it matters, but you know.
it indicates that he wasn't the author. That it's the way
You
the
know,
verses are
Paul
worded.
wrote 14 books, you know.
Yeah.
He was here.
Right.
I was going to ask him about Rob Bowman, but there was no time
Yeah,
left.
yeah,
But
right.
from one sentence to the next, you're gonna find major differences. This guy's cutting a rock. And you're telling me he's gotta be consistent or he can't be the same person? I don't know if it's the right box or not. I can tell you this, that's a lame argument.
Yeah.
I was not impressed.
Yeah. I do talk about Dom in that PowerPoint. I just, for sake of time, and I just wanted to give you the things that would be most helpful. If I'd done deeply into was he buried, it wouldn't be as helpful as saying, I know this guy, here's how his mind works. And why
I read something from Phil Johnson many years ago when we were doing the Pyromaniacs blog about this time Moody, at the same time Bart was there. He implied something much different than Bart's stated apology type of why he left war. He implied there was something else much going on with you.
On my book,
Something
my
personal.
staff helped me.
Well, Tom Wright, N.T. Wright has told me
We
that
didn't, but that was our.
there's something dark.
And so, but I mean.
I haven't picked up on that. I think I'm pretty,
Oh, you did tell me that.
but I'm not saying that it's not the case.
Good to meet you. We met this morning.
In some ways, Bart and Tom are very similar.
Me, I remember we had something.
Both very winsome, very good writers. I think Tom is more artistic than his writing. And neither one wants to be corrected in public.
Bart Ehrman.
Tom's initials should be I.M.
He grew up
I
with
am right.
evangelical went to Western college.
You know,
And then,
the
after
introduction,
he graduated,
what I
he
do,
about
these books,
about
the books I've
not
done,
the Reformation,
yeah, they're not co-written in the sense that Bart and Craig and I sat down and said, what are we going to say together? They're more about what we're saying to one another, or frankly, to people looking on. Yeah, Bart never really debates with the individual. He never has a conversation with another scholar in public. He's always talking to the audience through.
Because
And
if there
good
is no
debaters
God,
tend to do
there is
that.
nothing good.
It's not unique to
By
Bart.
which we can
Brought
measure
up the real problem with the way he writes publicly as opposed to the way he
So
writes
if
for
we
his
don't
peers, it's so
have
radically different. and that's
a
what
measuring
many
stick that
people
is.
point to.
Yeah.
That's what ABR pointed out, what he says to the public is different than what he says to scholars.
Yeah.
Right,
That's for
yeah.
Dan
public
Brown did the
use.
same thing in Da Vinci Code. He literally tells his fan club, this is the real thing, and then he gets out, oh, hey, it's just novels, guys, come on, relax. He's so dishonest.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so,
God is the definition of good.
Organization and a PowerPoint offer, and then buy the book.
okay,
It's this
you
one.
got cash?
Yes, I do. I got 15.
When you're only lucky with, you really don't have a choice. Either God from whom good comes,
Saturday, 10 o'clock,
or you have nothing. We are self-created.
You can, but I'll lose it.
Life is simple.
Email me, and then I'll reply and attach. Okay. That's, and, I am so upset.
Yeah, I mean, if evolution is the answer,
But you know,
everything came into existence first,
I
and
am-
why nothing for no.
I'd be embarrassed to be a philosopher and not to be absent-minded,
There is only predator.
but I never forget that I forget stuff. So, but I do have this paper if you want.
Yeah, I'm interested in what you mentioned about that.
It's survival of the survival of the fittest. The fittest may be faster because we can't escape the threat of something more predatory. So predator and prey, we might be able to. This is a good line.
In terms of the website, Bob, it's rich in content.
So you go, yes, here. I have to go introduce Joe Whitcher, so. That's a good start. Should be the same here.
Schmidt,
Marie, you want? Yes. Yeah, you want Haiti? You went Okai, right? Okai. Yeah, there's a big history shoe. He's an apologetics teacher, and he's got a big theological school in Milo, in the Okai. One of the biggest theological schools in Haiti up there.
Is that where Robert Mercy and Meg Mercy was there? Is that it?
Maybe.
Compound.
Yeah.
The years when they get
You heard of Wallace I know Wallace. He's still alive. He's 96. His wife passed away last year. He's a legend. He led my dad to the Lord, who was Jewish, who didn't believe in God for years, and at the end he accepted his Wallace. He was friends with Wallace. Yeah, I'm dead 25 years down there. I'm in St. Mark, near St. Mark.
Yeah, we used to travel through St. Mark.
Yeah.
It's out by the pond
I
side.
wish I had more time to speak.
Okay, you better go. Okay, we'll talk.
All right. Let's see, I'm gonna get a, I guess the money I'm gonna get a book.
Dave, 1 o'clock on here.